you to stand as you are able for the reading of the word.
Good morning. My name is Lauren Jones, and I'm a deacon here at Mercy View. Today we'll be reading from 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. And these pages can be found on, or these verses can be found on page 138 of the blue Bibles underneath the chairs. And if you don't own a Bible in your home, or if you know somebody who needs one, please take it. It would be our gift to you. So, all right, starting in chapter 18, verse 1. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword, and his bow, and his belt. This is the word of the Lord.
Praise be to God. Thank you, Lauren. I think that was sort of Lauren's had to do some really beefy readings recently, so that's our I'm sorry, Pastor. No, that's what we're going to look at this morning. It is packed with so much, actually, and so I'm excited about getting in that with you. But first, if you're visiting with us, my name is Brad, one of the pastors here. Welcome. If you're joining us for the first time, glad that you're here. And if I haven't met you, I'd love to do that after our service. I want to ask you this question as we get started this morning, but it's one that might be hard to answer, depending on where you kind of sit in your life as you think about your relationships and friendships, and that is this. Would you say that you are lonely? You may have a lot of people around you. Maybe you have a lot of people you follow on social media. They're your, quote, friends. It's not that you are literally alone, but would you say, Brad, if I'm being honest with you, I feel lonely. I feel alone in life. Well, loneliness isn't anything new in some sense. 100 years ago in the 1920s, when the telephone started to pop up, a lot of folks thought, man, that's going to really ruin what neighborly visits look like, where you just sort of kind of pop up, everybody loves Raymond kind of mode, where you just pop up at somebody's house and say, hey, you want to chat, want to hang out? In the 1970s, people blamed job relocations for social and family communities starting to split apart. And you know this, today, smartphones and social media, we're very connected as a people, but somehow we are more isolated than we've ever been. And studies show that young people, both here and in Europe, are hanging out with their friends and family way less than they used to. Some countries, like the UK and Japan, have actually appointed loneliness ministers to combat isolation among their people. Some health experts are actually calling loneliness a serious public health crisis. Now, loneliness isn't just about not having people around. You can be around a lot of folks and still feel very lonely. It's much deeper than that. You and I were made for real, meaningful relationships. And I'll go even a little further and say friendships. And no amount of scrolling, no amount of surface level connection can ever replace that, even though we may try to replace it. So let me ask you this last question. If God himself even said it's not good for man to be alone, how do we build true, genuine friendships in a world that's pulling us further and further apart? Today we are jumping back into our series in the book of 1 Samuel, called In Search of a King. Last week we did our annual State of the Church, and if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, if you weren't here, or maybe you were in Mercy View Kids, I would encourage you to listen to it. It's very important for you to hear. But yeah, this week we're jumping back into our series in 1 Samuel 18. We're looking at just the first 4 verses of this chapter because of what's in it. These first 4 verses actually capture for us some things that we need to get our heads and our hearts wrapped around as it relates to the idea of friendship. And I want you to see 2 things as we do that this morning. The first is this: genuine friendship isn't found, it's forged. Genuine friendship isn't just sort of discovered, it's cultivated, it's forged. And then second, genuine friendship isn't self-seeking, it's sacrificial. It isn't self-seeking, it's sacrificial. So, if you have your Bibles or electronic devices, keep them open to those first 4 verses of 1 Samuel 18. That's where we'll be this morning. And as you're looking there again, as we saw 2 weeks ago, I should say, the Israelites were stuck in a standoff with the giant Goliath. The giant was threatening the Israelites, mocking their God, terrifying their king. Saul was terrified. The Israelite army was terrified. There was nothing was happening. The threats were coming out, and the Israelites weren't responding. And so we saw in our story that we have a shepherd boy, David, who enters the scene armed with 5 stones and a sling and a very big faith with nothing to fear. And David looked at the giant and thought, the giant, if I have God on my side, the giant is not an obstacle. It's an opportunity for me to display the glory of God working through me. And that's exactly what happened. David takes down Goliath, and the nation erupts in celebration, and God gets the glory. And now as we move into 1 Samuel 18, we see a couple of outcomes from the defeat of Goliath. And we're looking this morning at the first of the 2 outcomes, and this one is a positive outcome. Look with me, if you would, again at verse 1. Let me just read that again. Here's the first of 2 outcomes. We'll look at the second outcome next week. This is the first one, and this is the positive one. Here's what it says. As soon as he, David, had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return David to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him. Again, this is the same phrase, as his own soul. So what captured Jonathan's attention? Right, we're not really actually given the specific answer to that question in our passage, but I think we get a sense of what likely happened, what he observed, what he noticed. If you go back to the end of 1 Samuel 17, look with me if you would, beginning there in verse 55. We didn't talk about this last week because we ran out of time, but after David defeats Goliath, we see Saul is very curious about this David guy. Now, he has already invited him into the palace as his armor bearer and his musical therapist, so to speak. But he wouldn't have necessarily known David real well. But now that David has defeated their enemy, Saul is very curious about this David guy. And so he goes to his commander of his army named Abner and says, who is this guy? Abner tells Saul who he is. And Saul says, bring him to me. I need to talk to him and get to know him. And so you see there at the end of 1 Samuel 17, David comes before Saul with, just don't miss this, the head of Goliath in his hands, all right? That would have been quite a scene. But he engages then in a conversation with Saul. And I think what we can infer here is that Jonathan is listening in. Jonathan is the son of Saul. He was listening in on the conversation that Saul and David were having. And so as he's observing, as he's listening to David recount why he did what he did, how he did what he did, and ultimately just like here's where God fits into the picture. I'm sure David was talking about that with Saul. It really brings us to this answer to the question is what captured Jonathan's attention? There is no doubt in my mind we are actually supposed to make a connection here as well between this moment and the previous time in 1 Samuel that we've heard of Jonathan. This isn't the first time. If you remember back in 1 Samuel 13 and 14, Jonathan, just like David in many ways, took the lead to go and battle this outpost of Philistines that Saul, his dad, wouldn't. He had courage. He went, and actually a small group of people scared a massive army, a Philistine army, and the Philistine army ran away. So back in 1 Samuel 13 to 14, we actually see, in much the same way David interacts with Goliath, Jonathan has a similar kind of courage, a similar kind of bravery, and I think we're supposed to see that connection here. And so I think Jonathan was listening in on David's conversation with Saul, and what he heard caught his attention because it was stuff that was important to Jonathan. And actually, I think it goes pretty deep. When he heard, Jonathan, of David's feats, what he saw in David, what he heard from David, was the kind of faith that Jonathan knew that Israel needed. It's the kind of faith that Jonathan had, and he knew that a future leader, or just any kind of leader in Israel, right? There was no one that stepped up to fight Goliath except David. And at a minimum, I think Jonathan was like, we need more leaders like that. We need more faithful, brave, and courageous leaders. And so I think that Jonathan was like, we need that kind of faith to help our country, our nation. We need that as well. See, with Saul as his father, Jonathan knew firsthand what fear and what compromise and what half-hearted faith looked like, how it would affect a leader negatively and a nation then negatively. But in Jonathan, David saw a hope for Israel's future, a glimpse of what was true about being God-centered as a leader. And it says this, in that moment that Jonathan observed that he heard that, what caught his attention? His heart was knit to David's. It says that he loved him as his own soul. In other words, he saw David's successes and David's calling as inseparable from his own. Are you with me? Now look with me, if you would, the beginning of verse 2. Let me just read that again. I just read it, but this gives us some insight into what's happening with David in this moment. It says, and Saul took him, the king. Again, he's a king really in name only right now. But Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house, not let David return to Jesse's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. So King Saul takes David back to the palace, which is where David was before, but he promotes him. And we don't know exactly, he's promoted, it seems to be promoted militarily. He's going to have a little more responsibility. He's not going to be the commander of the army like Abner was, but he's going to be pretty close to Abner. He's actually going to have some leadership in the military, even over his own brothers, who would have probably hated that. But look with me there. What you see happening there in this part of our passage today is that essentially David is being promoted. We're starting to see this movement happen in the life of David from the field as a shepherd to not only the palace, but eventually the throne here very soon. He's on that trajectory. Now don't miss this though either. Jonathan and David together here in verse 3, it says that they do something together that in ancient times, in the ancient world, would have been considered one of the most solemn, one of the most binding, and one of the most intimate ways that two parties come to an agreement. It says that they made a covenant. Now, some people believe that there is a kind of covenant in verse 4 when Jonathan gives David some of his own belongings. And though that is one way that a covenant can be made, I actually don't think that's the covenant that is being spoken of here. We're going to talk about verse 4 in just a moment. But I think what happened in verse 4 is what happened after the covenant itself was made. Here's what I mean. In the ancient world, to make a covenant with someone literally meant to cut a covenant. And usually it was done in one of two ways. Either of these two ways I'm getting ready to describe to you, though, involved blood. It was a blood promise that was made between two parties. Again, we don't know exactly what kind of covenant they cut. We don't see those specifics here. But it either was this one, they walked between two pieces of a sacrificed animal to represent a walk into death that would prove their commitment to one another until they died, or they would cut across their palm or their wrist, and then they would shake hands and their blood would mix with one another. Either way, this wasn't just an informal gesture. This wasn't just something that they did passively. It was a binding and a solemn pledge that Jonathan and David would have made to one another, sealed in, yes, blood. Now look with me at verse 4 again. What I think we have here is the result of that blood promise, that covenant that Jonathan made with David, because it's really describing Jonathan's actions towards David, not like this two-way thing. And so Jonathan, remember this, as far as anyone would have known at this time, he was the heir to the Father's throne. And so what we see happening here, this is really cool. Jonathan, in giving his robe to David, he is signaling something he doesn't even really understand yet, that David is going to be the future king someday. Right? That robe was a symbol of what it meant to be an heir to the throne. And so he is providentially signaling, whether he knows it or not, a transfer of his own identity, his own inheritance, his own future to David. It is a foreshadowing of David's future crowning as king. It's astounding, honestly. I don't know if Jonathan knew this, but it's a foretelling nonetheless. Now, the belt that Jonathan gave David, that's what would carry weapons. It would have that bow and the sword on it that's mentioned here. That was also a way in which Jonathan was offering, and we're going to see this in the chapters to come. Jonathan is showing a pledge that I'm going to be a part of who protects you, David. I'm going to be a defense for you. Just think about this for a moment. Here's Jonathan, an heir to the throne. And whether he completely understood what was happening right here, he saw beyond his own current power, his own current position, and what was more important to him was to show a commitment to a friend who, yes, would one day be king. In many ways, what Jonathan is doing here is an exchange of everything that he had for the man that God had chosen, even if he didn't know it yet. It's amazing. At the bottom of all of this, Jonathan's actions as a response to the covenant here were a picture of a friend, of what friendship looks like, of what a true friend does for another friend. And we could just say it this way: he was willing to lay down everything for the good of David. Now, in our modern times, friendship is misunderstood, like greatly misunderstood. It's distorted, what we think about it. It's something that I think it's a hard question for us to answer. What is friendship? What is a friend? How am I supposed to be a friend? Part of the reason is that we tend to think of it as something that should just happen naturally, right? Without a whole lot of work on our part. Like, we confuse constant connectivity with others with true connection. Thinking that just because we have seen an update from someone on their social media that we're actually involved in their lives. We're quick to hit follow or like, but we're really slow actually to step into something deeper with other people. We're often looking for friendships that don't ask a whole lot of us, right? Relationships that don't require real vulnerability or effort. We idolize compatibility We idolize shared interests with others rather than committing to love and serve one another, even if we're different. We avoid friendships that challenge us, right? We avoid friendships that prefer the kind of relationships that affirm us and make us feel comfortable. And I think there are a few reasons for all of those things. There's just a handful of ways that we have misunderstood friendship. One is we've been hurt before by friends. All right, we don't want to risk again opening ourselves up to someone. It feels very dangerous to do that. And so we keep people at arm's length, even if it leaves us lonely. We'd rather be lonely than to risk that. Another reason is that we live in a world that tells us to put ourselves first. Like, friendship becomes about what we then get rather than what we can give. And that leaves us also in this cycle of shallow and transactional relationships where we never are truly known. I think another reason is that we've got a million things pulling us away from genuine friendship, pulling at us that take time that we'd rather spend on things that feel more rewarding to us or even more gratifying to us. And I just said that one of the reasons we really struggle with friendships is we have this expectation that they would just sort of happen, that they would sort of find us, right? But we see here in our story today that couldn't be further from the truth. That's not how it works, right? Like, if we look at the story of Jonathan and David, we find that their friendship involved the cutting of a covenant with one another. And actually, there's some stuff even in that, to me, that give us some insight about what friendship really should look like for us this morning. And it brings me to the first thing that I want to invite you to see as we look at this morning, and it's this. Friendship isn't found, it's forged. Friendship isn't just found. It's not just discovered. It's forged. So let's talk about what I mean by that. Actually, I need to do something real quick before we talk about that. Because there is something kind of lurking under the surface here in this passage that we just need to address. And I'm just going to address it very quickly and we'll move on. But many modern interpreters have tried to twist the relationship between David and Jonathan here into something romantic. Even some have went even further to claim that it was somehow homosexual in nature. But that's not what is going on here. Both David and Jonathan would have been well-versed in the Torah at this time, what we would call the law. And they would have known that there was a prohibition on that kind of relationship. And honestly, maybe even more telling is that we're never told anything about that kind of relationship between the two. We're going to find out here in this later in this book, and even in 2 Samuel, that both David and Jonathan were married and had children. So the move to romanticize their relationship comes from those who want to reinterpret Scripture here through the lens of a modern or a secular sensibility to justify, really, what the Bible condemns. Now, back to the idea of friendship being forged, not found. As we look at the covenant that David and Jonathan made with one another, this wasn't a random or superficial or passive kind of approach to friendship. Notice that it was actually based on something. Remember, we're inferring this a little bit, but Jonathan overheard the conversation that David was having with Saul, and I'm sure of this, that what Jonathan heard was something that resonated deeply within his own heart. There was something that connected, it knit his heart with David. In other words, his connection, his friendship that's going to begin here with David, it was based on something. It was founded upon something. In his book, The Four Loves, here's how C.S. Lewis says, here's how he would say what's happening here. Friendship arises out of mere companionship when two or more of the companions discover that they have in common some insight or interest or even taste which the others do not share, and which till that moment each believed to be his own unique treasure. See, David and Jonathan's covenant with one another was a bond between two souls united by a common vision. Right? So what was that common vision? The glory of God and the good of Israel. In other words, there was substance to their relationship. Here's Lewis again in this same book. He says, friendship must be about something. Even if it were only an enthusiasm for dominoes or white mice. Those who have nothing can share nothing. But those who are going nowhere can have no fellow travelers. I would say that then in the positive. Just those who are going somewhere, those who do share something, have fellow travelers. So what does it mean to forge a friendship? Well, I think it means this in light of what we're talking about. It means that you're not waiting for a friend to find you. See, real friendship, and many of you know this already, they never come to you on a silver platter. It's always crafted through, listen, hard work, time, and as we see in our passage today, a shared vision. A shared vision for life. This is why the church is such fertile ground for friendships. At least it should be. You and I are not here in this church at this time, like in 2025, just by accident. God has sovereignly and providentially brought us together, these people, at this time, to wrestle with questions like this, I believe. What does it look like for me to have friends in Mercy View? So let me ask you, who is someone in this church you've been meaning to connect with, but you haven't? Because that person is someone that you are bound together with by a greater purpose, like already, God's glory and His kingdom. So when was the last time that you intentionally invited someone into your life or offered your time to serve them? How could you make time this week to intentionally build relationships with others that you're connected to here meaningfully at Mercy View that are centered on God's glory and His kingdom and His purpose in the world? Who in your life you know is feeling isolated right now, and how can you be a friend to them? I want to encourage you to think about friendships. You can have friendships outside of this church. I'm not saying you should only have friendships here, but this is a fertile ground for you to press into relationships that you have here. And as you do that, I just want to remind you, don't wait for someone to reach out to you. Take the first step towards someone else. Invite them to lunch this week. Invite them to coffee this week. And start to forge a more meaningful friendship with them. Now, as you do that, there is something else that is going to be required of you. And it's honestly, I think, one of the most, if not the most difficult part in a relationship or a friendship. And we really see this here, I think, in the kind of love that David and Jonathan had one another. There was a necessary partner with that love that they would have had to have had in order to have a real, genuine friendship with one another. Lewis says this well again in The Four Loves. He says, to love at all is to be, listen, vulnerable. Love anything and your heart will be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one. Lewis is saying that real, true love demands vulnerability. And that means, listen, risk. It's always going to involve risk. And this is not just this idea of vulnerability is not just a feminine quality. It's a deeply human one, okay? So it means that you have to be, in a relationship, willing to be open to the possibility of pain, of rejection, of disappointment. even after you would say, like, I've already experienced that before with a previous friend, a failed friendship. Risking yourself and being vulnerable with someone again means that you're willing to do that for the sake of friendship. And I get this is where the arm's length thing comes in for a lot of you, because I've been there. It's easier to just kind of keep people at arm's length, hedge your bets, assume that this is just not going to work out, and really stay lonely. And I'm just pleading with you this morning, that's not the way to go. You will miss out on the kind of friendship that we see here in the life of David and Jonathan, the kind that they shared. And it is a kind of friendship that was forged. It was cultivated. It was worked at. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just found. It wasn't just discovered. So first, friendships are forged. They're not necessarily just found. But there is a second thing that I think we see in our passage today, and it's on the same theme of friendship, and it's this. Genuine friendship isn't self-seeking. In other words, it's not about you. It is sacrificial. It is others-focused. And it's a real, honestly, it probably sounds odd to think about. When we think about friendship, we're thinking about someone being a friend to us. That's, by the way, one of the things I think that gets us hung up. But friendship is as much about having a friend is as being a friend, right? And you cannot be a friend if your friendship is about you, if it's about self-seeking, if it's about your own needs. And I think we see that here in this passage. In the way that Jonathan gives some of his most precious possessions to David is where I think we see this. His robe, his belt, his armor, his sword, his bow. These were not just items to Jonathan. They were symbols of his identity. They were symbols of his power. And in a sense, they were symbols of his future that, again, I don't know if he understood all of this in this moment, but that he was willing to give up for the sake of his friend David. And so Jonathan, in giving those things to David, he wasn't just demonstrating his loyalty to David. We're going to see Jonathan be very loyal to David in the chapters to come. But it wasn't just about being loyal. It was choosing to put the good of their shared vision above his own ambitions and desires. And I think in a lot of ways what I just said is also a foretelling. This is what's going to happen with Jonathan and David. We're going to continue to see him put the good of their shared vision, what's best for the nation of Israel, above his own needs. We see the beginning of that here. And that's what real friendship looks like. It's about laying down your own agenda for the sake of another. It may even include, choosing to elevate someone else, to see their flourishing, to see their needs as more important than your own comforts or convenience. Jonathan was not seeking himself at all in this moment. He was seeking the good of God's kingdom. He was seeking the good of the future of his people by, in a sense, giving up his own glory for another. That's profound. So what kind of sacrifice should we be thinking about as we think about friendships? What does that kind of sacrifice look like for us? Well, I think it starts with what we just said. You have to stop asking, what's in it for me? See, real friendship is never a transaction. If you treat your relationships, your spouse this way, or friends, you're treating them like a commodity. You are like a consumer, consuming them in relationship. Real friendship is about showing up. It's about leaning in and laying down your time and your comfort and even your pride to serve another person. It's about choosing sometimes real inconvenience over ease. And real commitment to one another over your own comfort. But that kind of sacrificial friendship is not what our culture teaches us is most important. The reason why we struggle so deeply with this kind of friendship is because we have bought in to the way in which culture says relationships should work. We're told, for example, to protect our time. We're told to protect our comfort. We're told to keep our options open, right? We're told to prioritize our own happiness, to cut people off when they become inconvenient, to only invest in a relationship where there's some ROI. But friends, that's not friendship. Again, that's treating the relationship like a transaction and the other person like a commodity. That's not friendship at all, because you are hedging your bets. But real friendship always calls us to risk, to invest, and to commit. And this is what we see in this story today. It will cost you something. Real, genuine friendship, friends, listen, is costly. So we need to, this morning, ask ourselves if we are in our friendships for what we can get out of them rather than what we can give, what is that really? It means we need to reevaluate what we think about what friendships are, right? So if friendships for you is about what you can get rather than what you can give, like if it's the first part of that, what you get, you will never know the joy of what it means to give in a friendship. So let's just talk about this more practically, right? What might this kind of sacrificial friendship look like? Well, it may look like making space in your life, especially in a moment where this is happening, when it's very inconvenient for you, like your schedule is full and you're exhausted, but you know that you need to intentionally carve out some time to just be present with someone who is your friend, who needs a person to just like be with them and hang out with them. Maybe just listen to them. That will mean making margin for that. It may be in a moment of time. It may mean like walking through a mess with your friend who is struggling deeply with sin or maybe just doubt or failure. And instead of that temptation we all have to pull away from the mess, the ditch, like getting in the ditch with him, you say, no, I'm going to step in with patience and with grace, and I'm going to remind them that they're not alone. I'm with them. Here's another thing. It may look like speaking truth when it's uncomfortable. Real friends do this, by the way. When your friend is heading down a destructive path, and it would be a lot easier for you to stay silent, you risk the awkwardness, you risk the tension, because you know that real love doesn't stay quiet. It may look like celebrating when your friend gets the promotion you wanted, or you look at their life and their life seems to be moving forward in a way that yours feels totally stuck, and yet you choose to rejoice with them rather than wallow in comparison with them. Those are just a few examples, but again, this is the kind of friendship that Jonathan and David exhibit in our passage today, the kind that is truly costly, sacrificial, the kind that is focused on the good of the other person. Not what you get, but what you can give. Not that you have a friend, but that you get to be a friend. It's the kind that isn't self-seeking. Now, it's one thing to see the kind of friendship that as we look in on probably one of the most famous friendships in all the Bibles, we are looking at it this morning. Oh, this is the kind of stuff that real friendships are made of. But we really still have a question that sits underneath all of this, and it's this, is how do we do this? How do we get the strength to actually live out what it means to forge friendships, to have friendships that are truly sacrificial? Well, I think our passage gives us two things to look at to help us out. First, let's think about this. Look back at the blood covenant. Jonathan and David bind themselves together sacrificially to one another with what? Their own blood. In the new covenant, let's think about this just for a moment. Jesus binds himself to us with what? His own blood. And in that work that Jesus does for us, he secures our salvation. Not just friendship, no less than that, but our salvation with his very life. We actually see something that even Jonathan and David weren't able to do for one another. A true life-for-life exchange. Christ's blood was poured out to purchase us, to cleanse us, to make us his own, as Ephesians 1 says. And in this sacrifice, Jesus has bound himself to us in an unbreakable union. But second, look to Jonathan's gifts. When Jonathan stripped himself of his robe and he placed it on David's shoulders, what is that a picture of? I think it's a picture of Jesus clothing us in his righteousness. And in that, remember, this is an exchange that's happening between God and man. In that gift of righteousness that God gives us, we're actually exchanging all of our sin for all of his righteousness. See, Jonathan's gifts to David symbolized a total giving of himself. That's Christ's covenant with us. Christ offers us his righteousness, his power, and his victory. Through Christ's covenant love, we are made heirs of the kingdom now that we did not earn. By the way, just like David. So friend, if you're wondering where the strength to live out sacrificial friendship, where that comes from, look no further than Christ. You can really say it this way: friendship isn't just something we do. Friendship is something that we reflect. We've been befriended by the King himself, and this is where the strength to live out true friendship comes from. Listen, I'm going to make a bold statement. The only true thing that will actually sustain any earthly friendship is that. You will not have the ability to endure, to risk again, to be vulnerable, unless you see what King Jesus has done for you. It's the only thing that will actually sustain any earthly friendship. Why? Because friendships can be extremely difficult, extremely disappointing, and you will be tempted to give up too quickly on them. But through Jesus, he doesn't just invite us into friendship with him. Listen, he empowers us to live it out. Because of our relationship with Jesus, we can lay down our pride and our comfort and our self-interest in relationships with other people because he did that for us. So if friendship feels costly, if sacrifice in relationship feels too much, remember the sacrifice of Jesus. And when we grasp that truth, when we truly see what's been given to us, we will stop asking, what's in it for me? So friends, here at Mercy View, let's press more deeply into friendships with one another through the power of Christ. Some of those questions I asked earlier, be thinking about who is that here for me? Who do I need to connect with this week? Have coffee, have lunch with, begin to forge a friendship with. Let me just speak to the men for just a moment. Brothers, this means stepping beyond surface level conversations and standing shoulder to shoulder with other men in this church in the struggle and strength of life. Ladies, sisters, this means bearing other women's burdens with grace and truth, not just when it's easy for you, but when it's costly for you. And for us all, it means stepping into the mess of each other's lives with patience, with persistence, not just offering sort of trite and kind words, saying, hey, I'll pray for you, and we really don't pray for them. But sacrificial love, sacrificial truth. I pray that in the days to come, the kind of friendships that people find here at Mercy View aren't transactional. They are transformational. Friendships that show up, friendships that stay present and serve one another even when it's hard. But it will cost you your time, your comfort. But isn't that exactly what Christ has done for you? The good news is, if we can pursue this together, what we gain actually is even more than just great friends. And that's a great thing to have. But we gain a community that mirrors the love of Christ to a watching world. How will they know that God is real? They will know by the way that Christians love one another. What a great gift. In addition to the gift of friendship that we could be like pursuing together, a watching world that looks in at Mercy View and goes, I want in on that. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to look at one of the most